Welcome, Karl Lutchmayer. Great to see you, Karl.
Great to see you, Paul. It's been far too long.
So tell us these fantastic developments that happened in Mumbai.
Oh, well, it's not just Mumbai. It is actually sort of pan-India. I mean, obviously, a lot of stuff is happening in Mumbai. But as you probably know, and certainly your listeners will know, India is not really well known for Western classical music. Of course, it's known for Hindustani and Carnatic music, and Bollywood, of course, is huge, and all those things. Um, and indeed, sort of basically, after the British left in 47, there were only really two small communities that looked out for Western music. One was the Roman Catholics, partly in Mumbai because there's quite a large enclave there, but also in Goa. And of course, Goa was still Portuguese till 1962, so there was still that kind of tradition going on. And then the Parsis, the Zoroastrian community, were very strong on Western music, particularly in Mumbai. They're mostly based in Mumbai and Pune, which is a little way to the east of Mumbai, and so that was also a strong enclave. And to be fair, whilst it's not quite perhaps so recognised, in the northeast of India, the Methodists had been quite strong and very important, and so there was a kind of Western choir tradition to some extent, which again has flourished more recently. So basically from 47 or whatever onwards, there are these very, very small communities who are just kind of keeping the flame going. And essentially what began to happen is that teachers basically started teaching to the exams, so, Trinity and ABRSM, but particularly as it happens, Trinity College of Music exams. And it became a sort of a snake eating its own circle, because the teacher would teach up to grade 8 and then pass that on to the student and so on. And very, very few musicians actually, a few did, but most didn't break out of that circle. But I don't know, it's about 15 years ago, maybe. Yeah, probably about that, maybe even 20 years ago. Firstly, India kind of relaxed its rules about imports. So, for instance, when I was a kid and I was traveling out to India for my holidays quite regularly, see my grandparents and so on, I wanted a piano to practice. And the only pianos you could practice has been left over from pretty much the Victorian period. And they kind of, when someone sold one, the next one person bought this dilapidated thing and tried to stick it together with glue and Kleenex and sellotape or whatever. And essentially, unless you were mega rich and could pay amazing amounts of tax, you couldn't have a new piano in India. And that all changed, I think it's probably about 20 years ago. And suddenly you could buy instruments and people got interested. And what's been really interesting that I've seen over the last, let's say, probably 15, 20 years, is that it's just kind of been such a wide a set of communities that have got interested in music performance, Western music, whatever. Not just Western music, we'll talk about that, I guess, coming up. But buying instruments, sales of instruments were pretty much exponential, and it's occasionally literally. I'm quite good friends with the key people in India who are the sales people for instruments. Quite frequently, there are no instruments left in the showroom because they've all been sold before Christmas or before Diwali or something. And it's an extraordinary change. And now it's all the communities. We see the Hindus, the Muslims, all sorts of different Hindu communities, Sikhs, everybody. They're all making music. And particularly, as it happens, a lot of Western music. They're doing the exams that we all know in England and around. And there's this kind of real passion. And we're even meeting parents who, whereas previously, you might be allowed as an Indian kid to do some music studying or whatever, but your schooling was the most important thing. You had to get on with the exams and go and do doctor, lawyer, or accountant. And I was supposed to be a lawyer, as it happens. I'm still getting around to it, maybe one day. So I was supposed to be a lawyer. Haven't got around to that. And parents didn't really allow their children to do music or arts or something. That wasn't a proper thing that you did. So actually now I'm meeting lots of parents who allow that kind of thing and are encouraging their kids to take up music and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of background. Anything you want to ask about that, Paul?
Well,
I know I've been talking too much.
No, it's much better that you talk. What's the state of play today with people learning music in India?
So, as I say, it's been extraordinary. I'll tell you, for instance, I meet lots and lots of teachers of all kinds, or music teacher of all kinds, instrumental or vocal or whatever, and I always ask them, "Do you have a waiting list?" Because once upon a time, to be a teacher, you had to keep your students because there weren't many students, and you didn't want to lose your income. Now, I have yet to meet a teacher who doesn't tell me that they have a waiting list because there are not enough teachers for the people who want to learn music. I mean, to the extent that, and it's surprising to us here, but you get what you get and you do what you can with what you've got. In India, it is not unusual to find someone who's done grade 3 or grade 4 already teaching the students below them and just kind of trying to keep up, because that's the marketplace, and you can't maybe find a better teacher close at hand. And it's very rare to have very experienced teachers. What's happened though over the last 15 years is that quite a few advanced students have now actually come to the West. They've studied in conservatoires and universities, particularly in England, to some extent in the States. I helped to facilitate that when I was a professor of Trinity Laban Conservatoire of Music and Dance, where we had a program of outreach, and I used to go and spend 3 or 4 months a year in sort of 1 month chunks in India, and identify gifted and hard-working young musicians, and gradually we managed to get scholarships for them to come over and so on. And so we started that kind of to and fro. But what's really heartening is most of them have come back to India because they've looked around Europe and gone, well, I can barely make a living here, and maybe I can keep, food on the table, but mostly I'm doing stuff that is a bit drudge work sometimes, or I'm just fighting to keep going because there's so many people here going back and creating really, really good careers for themselves as not just as teachers and performers and all stripes of educators, and particularly entrepreneurs who are kind of creating new ways to promote and produce music. So that's the really exciting kind of vibe at the moment, and that's particularly where I think you've got about to ask me a question there, Paul.
No.
Yeah. So and that's something. The problem with that for me, and I think for educationalists, is that there's this huge and ever increasing number of kids studying instruments, studying Western music, but they don't. It's not part of their kind of mother tongue of music. They're listening to Bollywood. They're listening to each community has their, rites of passage song, their wedding songs, their whatever. There are lots, of course, of patriotic songs and pan-India songs that are sung, all of these things. And then there's kid playing grade 3 violin who's playing, I don't know, some Mendelssohn or some Grieg. And of course, quite rightly, the aunts and the uncles and the grandparents come around and say, "Oh, you're playing the violin. Come on, play something." And they go, "No idea what you're playing." "Oh, that's very nice, dear." And what it seemed to me was really important is that these kids get the opportunity to perform music of their own. So I got together with some friends of mine in India, and the Music Teachers Board in England. The Music Teachers Board, really, really exciting board. They're the first virtual online music exam board, long before pandemic. They started out in 2011 with this idea that actually you could do music exams differently. You could do them online, and the key thing for them was that, well, the two key things I particularly liked. One was it's an online exam rather than trying to create, concert pianists who have to go into a strange room, play on a strange piano in front of a strange guy behind a desk and do it on that day, which is, usually the worst of you rather than the best of you. They said, okay, let's do music where we see the best of that person, and they can do it whenever they want. When, if they're ill, they don't have to do it that day. They can record it 5 days later, 10 days later, whenever they record it, on their home instrument, in a comfortable space. And let's encourage music making rather than necessarily that kind of stress, performance, adrenaline thing. Now, listen, I put my hands up. I love the stress, performance, adrenaline thing. That's what I do. And that's fine. But, 97% of the world doesn't want to be concert pianists, thank goodness. Otherwise, I'd be out of a job a billion times over, wouldn't I? So that was one thing they were doing. The second thing they were doing was that they were saying, well, if you've got a piece you want to play and it's not on our syllabus, no problem. Send it in to us. We'll check it over, and if it's the right sort of standard, you can play it because you want to play the music you want to play.
It's brilliant.
I mean, it's not hard to work that one out, of course. And in fact, actually, the third thing they said, well, if it's an online exam and you're sending in a recording, we can get instrumental specialists always to do it. So piano for piano, violin for violin, which is also great because you get supportive and interesting feedback. Anyway, so when they said, well, you can put anything, I just kind of sent them a message and said, listen, got an idea. We're in India. What if we created lots of music from Indian communities, from the Indian culture, and arranged it for, key instruments, piano, violin, classical guitar, contemporary guitar, etc., singing, and kind of authorized it. So I said, my team will write this, some grade 3 piano music, but it'll all be Indian, and you guys have a look at it and pass it as you will. And they said, yeah, that's a great idea. So for the last couple of years, that's what we've been doing. And of course, the uptake's been fascinating because now said person in Bangalore, Chennai, or wherever, Coimbatore, can sit there and be studying for grade 3 and might well still be playing one piece of Chopin or Grieg or whatever. Great. And then is playing a couple of pieces that they know really well, which are kind of popular songs from the films, or, community songs, folk songs, or whatever it is. And their friends are hearing and going, I want to do that. That's super cool. I want to play those pieces. Their grandparents are going, oh, yeah, singing along because they remember the film that came out in 1962 or whatever. And it's a really exciting idea that we don't have to make it all very Western focused in order to give a kind of music education. And of course, this is really linked into, as everybody knows, huge and expanding middle class in India, who are very education focused and want their young people to really have a great education in the arts and a well-rounded education, even if they're not quite sure about doing it as a profession, and that's a different thing yet. And it's just really, really exciting that now even the parents are going, oh, this isn't something totally alien to our culture. We might be playing the piano, but we're playing the music we know. So that's been the thing that I'm working on literally as we speak. I got back from Chennai yesterday, and we were doing several meetings with teachers. We had the guys from London out, the MD and the chief examiner. We had a really great trip, and just kind of contacting and meeting with lots of teachers. So that's the sort of second stage, if you will, Paul, of what's happening. And the key thing here is to try and build up two things: really massive grassroots. If you want a pyramid with 200 people at the top, you've got to have 2 million people at the bottom, whatever. It's exactly what China's done. I forget the figures, but there are supposedly 25 million kids playing the piano today, and you get a Lang Lang and a Yu Wang. If you've only got 250 kids playing the piano, it's very unlikely you're going to have quite a high pyramid. So that's the first thing. But the second thing, and this is the thing I'm very pleased about, and actually, in fact, why I'm and it's now sort of no longer a secret, I'm actually moving to India to Goa in January.
Congratulations!
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I'm not least to see the sun and eat the food every day, but I mean, when I say I'm moving there, of course, I'm going to be based there. I'm still have an international career, and I suspect I'll be in India about 8 months a year or so, but I'll still be in England. I'll still be wherever, and I still hope to meet you on various conveyances that we meet on, obviously, in this ship or that ship. Sorry, bell in the background. So let's see how that works. But the idea being that as this initiative grows, and I should say we are also really keen to support teachers in schools, as in teaching music curricula in schools. My job essentially there is to do teacher training, teacher support, teacher development. So the idea being that we get a much larger grassroots of people playing, making, thinking about music. But again, on top of that, we support the teachers, so we have much better teachers. Therefore, we have students who are really making the best of their opportunities and having the best opportunities they can, not just in one-to-one kind of music instrument vocal lessons, but in schools. And then we can say that we've got a culture of music making that is just kind of normal. And fortunately, about 3 years ago now, I think it must be, India created a new education policy for all schools, which included that there must be music in the education system. But
Brilliant.
I mean, of course, I mean, and it's obvious as well. We should all be doing that. But of course, at the moment, there aren't teachers to teach it, which is problematic. So we're saying, okay, well, that's the one thing we can definitely do, is support the teachers in their own journeys in teaching the kids and giving them resources and so on. And ultimately, what we will do as this company supporting exams is say, well, instead of using marketing to put posters up or whatever, our marketing is simply to support teachers all the way, whether they're in schools or whether they're in private teachers, because that's only going to be good for everybody. And that's going to be good for the musical life of the country. And eventually people will say, okay, music is much more normal. No issue about my child becoming musician or not becoming musician or whatever. But I'll tell you my favorite story so far about this last 15 years in India. Probably about 13 years ago, I was doing a piano workshop in India, and this guy came along, and he was quite a good pianist. I think he was probably about grade 5 or grade 6 at the time. And we had, in fact, I remember teaching him to do legato pedaling, which is a kind of a fairly essential but not very advanced piano technique. Anyway, so we got chatting, and I've stayed in touch with him ever since and helped him when I can, and he's occasionally come for piano lessons. But we've just been chatting, and he's done really well, and he's got right to the top of the exam system. He managed to get a diploma. He managed to go abroad for a year to study, and he's come back. But before he did that, his parents insisted he did an engineering degree, because that's the kind of good, sensible Bachelor of Engineering. India needs engineers, it seems, all over the place, and that's the kind of go-to safe kind of job. Fair enough. About, I think it's probably this time last year, I was having dinner with Akash, and we were just chatting about this and this. I said, anyway, of course we know each other very well now. I said, listen, your cohort from when you did your Bachelor of Engineering degree, so you're still in touch? He said, yeah, we kind of, a lot of us meet up once a year and go and have a party in Goa or whatever, and we're just kind of, we're hanging. I said, okay. So Akash now is a teacher, piano teacher, but he created 2 institutes. So he's got teachers under him, and essentially he lives in what we call Navi Mumbai, New Mumbai, which is part of Greater Mumbai, but it's quite a way out. So it's kind of a new infrastructure. I mean, I guess it's probably, again, 15, 20 years old, but it hasn't got that it hasn't got the old world feel, and it hasn't got obviously that many piano teachers, because they're all in South Mumbai, the more traditional part of Mumbai. So he's got these 2 institutions, and he teaches a lot of them himself, and he's got teachers below him teaching lower grades and so on. Very well organized. I said to him, listen, just roughly speaking, compared to your friends who are doing Bachelor of Engineering, who are exactly your contemporaries, and many of them have gone on to do Master of Engineering and have quite good jobs, what are your earnings like now, if you don't mind me asking? Because how does it parallel out against the engineers? Now, of course, there are probably over 1 million engineers in India at this point, and there are not so many diploma pianists. And he sat down, and we just sort of scribbled on a piece of paper and tried to work it out. And he did it 3 times because he couldn't quite believe the answer. And they said, yep, this is definitely true. And he reckons he earns what his friends earn in a month in 3 days.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's the bottom line of modern India. So I see lots of people in middle management giving up middle management to go and become piano teachers, because it's more lucrative. Of course, it's also more flexible and all of the rest of it. Yeah. But it's just a better job at the moment. And it's the energetic growth industry in the moment. It's like, there's all the other stuff's going on. Of course, there's commerce. Of course, there's all the rest of it. But suddenly this is coming out of nowhere. And I was chatting to another teacher in Chennai, as it happens. I sort of said, what kind of, have you got a lot of competition? And she said, yeah, within 5 kilometers of me, something like 10 other institutions have just come up in the last 2 years, also teaching piano. It's like, it's feels and sounds like all the stories I've heard about, like 1930s America, particularly New York and East Coast, or 1870s, 1880s St. Petersburg, where suddenly the kind of it's all on fire, or I guess
Mm.
1830s Paris. It's all happening. Everybody wants music, and at this point there aren't enough musicians. So it's I can't imagine there's a place that's got more growth in music at the moment than India. I'm reading that China people are doing a bit less musicking and selling pianos now, selling their own pianos and so on. So it might be, it's possible that India's the next big growth story in terms of music education and musicians. And, we may well start to have proper internationally renowned musicians of Indian origin, which would be great and exciting. Let's see.
I think I was going to ask you, Carl, that it always struck me because, I mean, for people that are listening to this, I mean, you're an utterly brilliant virtuoso concert pianist, and that's just a fact.
Thank you, Paul.
What happens when you get in a room with a tabla player?
In what sense?
In musically.
Well,
go on. But what was leading to the question with your master's degree master's degree about improvisation in
it's my PhD actually,
PhD,
but yeah, absolutely, yeah. Go on, but what do you mean? What happens? Tell me.
So what in respect of that, with the fantastic tradition of Indian music, which is one of the greatest in the world, are people encouraged possibly to use their improvisational skill with classical music like it used to be hundreds of years ago?
This is such a good question, Paul. Thank you. So, and of course, I'm in a curious position, as your listeners may or may not know. I grew up in England. I was born in England, and it's only now that I'm really going to India quite a lot. Though I was, my parents are both Indian, so I have the Indian traditions. But my parents are from Goa, so I've kind of Western traditions rather. They're Catholic, and there's a very particular kind of trajectory to this. So, two things, or maybe two or three things I'll say. First of all, of course, the Indian classical traditions are absolutely so strong, so vital. They've slightly evolved a little bit to accommodate 20th, 21st century living, and they understand that there might not be that kind of same guru acolyte relationship as there has been traditionally, and they know that that's going to be evolving in various ways, and they accept that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is maybe I'm too cautious, but I am very cautious that I'm the last person who should be wandering in going, hey, let's do fusion stuff, and let's bring Western into it, because these are very, very strong and noble and extraordinary traditions, absolutely. And in fact, some of my favorite musicians happen to be in those traditions. But equally, I meet up with I've been fortunate enough to meet Zakir Hussain, who of course extraordinary tabla player, but very much in every place. He's working with John McLaughlin of Shakti. He's written a tabla concerto for symphony orchestra and tabla. He plays very traditionally. He does all sorts of fusion things. Extraordinary person. Equally, I've done some work with L. Subramaniam, the violinist, who is again this very famous, sort of at the start, right back in the day of global fusion. In 1972, out in San Francisco, LA, and just kind of doing it. So I meet all of these people who are absolutely saying, well, we've got the tradition. There's nothing wrong with the tradition. It's perfectly stable. Let's see what we can do beyond that. And you're right. My particular interest of late, and my PhD thesis is all about this idea of not just having this script, which essentially, let's be honest, in the traditions of Western music, when I go out and play a Beethoven sonata, you expect to hear all the notes in the right order as Beethoven played them, and more recently, you expect me to have read all the letters and listened to the music on forte piano and so on, and pretty much give you an impression, albeit in the modern time, maybe on a modern Steinway, as to how that piece should have gone according to Beethoven. And what that means is I become a Beethoven tribute act. If it's the Beatles, I wear a wig and pretend to be strumming in whichever style, if it's early or late Beatles. And likewise, here I am. I'm not wearing a wig, but I should be kind of in the right style to give you that period performance, so you think, yeah, I just heard Beethoven as he would have wanted it. And of course, actually, even right through the 19th century, we have these ideas that it doesn't have to be like that, and that the performer can bring their own co-authorship in some ways. They can change the notes and still have the same piece. Because we're totally comfortable with Jimi Hendrix playing All Along the Watchtower by
Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan. Thank you. Sorry, I
Yeah.
lost his name there for a moment. And then Bob Dylan playing All Along the Watchtower in the style of, or moving on from Hendrix. And, you say, well, it's still All Along the Watchtower, isn't it? It's the same piece, but who's it by? It's by, this is the version by Bob Dylan, this is the version by Hendrix, this is the version by Bob Dylan after he heard Hendrix play it, etc., etc. So, in that sense, this idea of me being with Indian musicians going, well, actually, we can free these things up is interesting. My big problem is, for me, that I'm not well versed enough in those traditions to feel like I can make really valuable contributions. But I am in touch with lots of people who are much more well versed in those traditions, and it's been fascinating. Particularly working with El Subramaniam and his institution. It's called SAPA, S-A-P-A. They very much believe in teaching music and playing music that is both traditional Carnatic in their case, traditional Western, and the fusion in between. And those fusion ideas are particularly interesting. And what can be gleaned when you take the kind of rhythmic complexities of the Indian music. I mean, it's incredibly complex.
Yes.
But then throw in these elements that we've developed much more of harmony and dissonance and all of those things, and how they can play against rhythms. And there's been some fascinating stuff that comes out. Now, of course, those who are purists, whether in Western or Carnatic or Hindustani traditions, will immediately say, oh, well, this is diluted. And I suppose it is certainly evolved, changed or something. I don't know if it's weaker or stronger, but it's certainly not the tradition. And I think it's probably quite difficult to put your finger on actually producing something that really is excellent and has gone further, rather than is something that is sort of experimental. But the experimental has to happen in order to get further. And I think, again, mentioning them again, and I have no shame in mentioning them more than once, Shakti absolutely did that. They took, it seems to me, some of the best of India and the best of jazz and the best, I know, perhaps not classical in there, not quite yet, it was sort of Western classical, and produced something quite extraordinary. I've been fortunate enough to hear them a couple of times, 3 times, and it's always been mind-blowing when you hear Shakti play. And I think there is room for that confluence. I think it probably hasn't been done really successfully between Western classical and one of the Indian classical traditions yet. There's the Ravi Shankar Sitar concertos, of course, which I think were recorded by the RPO, I think it might have been, back in the 70s or early 80s. And I don't think that quite has worked yet. But I think that's still waiting to find a space. And what I am fascinated by is I know some younger composers in India who really are just absolutely amazingly adept and knowledgeable about all these traditions, and are writing things that are no tradition at all, and why should they be, but invigorating and mind-blowing and fascinating. And I see particularly, these uses of complex rhythmic structures and modes, of course, that come direct from the Indian traditions, but equally of harmonic processes and orchestral writing and so on that are from the Western tradition, seemingly moving towards a more unified music. So I find that absolutely fascinating. But I suspect in this situation, I'm the person who comes before the people who actually get to do it properly, because I think I haven't had enough exposure to both kinds to be able to balance those things out sufficiently well. But maybe I'm wrong. I mean, once I'm fully ensconced in India next year, there may be some experiments that happen that do work out. Let us see, what we can do about that.
I was just going to ask you one more question, Carl, because I know time is
always not at all. But yeah,
I was going to ask you about musical education, because I had a conversation recently with somebody about musical education. I don't really teach at all, although I went through the education system. And they were saying to me, oh, well, music theory seems complex. And I said to them, I said, really, if you break it down to its basics, if you can count to 16, you can practically do any music, any type of music theory, which of course is making it simple. But how is it in India? Because rhythmically, Indian music, as you said, is from a Western point of view, incredible and incredibly complex and beautiful. How do you go about teaching Western the harmony to people in your schools?
Yeah, well, so, okay, so that's a really interesting question, because I think, as you have just said, I think we sometimes make what we call theory quite abstruse and quite difficult, because we're trying to understand, if you're trying to understand a Wagner opera and how it does what it does, okay, fine, there's a lot of stuff happening there, but equally, in terms of how we're experiencing it, that's a kind of a different feel. And then if you want to say, well, okay, what's the harmony actually doing? Well, we might have some arguments along the way, but as you say, if you can count and think a bit, it can be as easy or as difficult, I guess, as you want it to be. And I think that's a really, really fair issue. And I would go for two further things before we get to your actual question. One is that I think music theory is almost always tied down to, or in some way linked to, a kind of political, in the broader sense, outlook. Yeah. When you're Schenker, you're trying to prove a point through music theory. Everybody comes to music theory and says, well, I'm trying to prove this point and I'm using these systems to show that the music does this or the music does that. So I think there probably isn't music theory without some kind of baggage. Otherwise, music theory can be pretty simple, unless you're trying to prove a bigger theory. So I think that's kind of key there. And I think the third thing we need to think about when we're thinking about, particularly as we move across to India, is, okay, why are we calling it theory and why are we not calling it musicianship? Because musicianship is all that you and I do, and all of our friends, to make music, and that's what's important. This thing called theory, which is often the kind of thing I'm talking about now, is that thing you do by a bunch of people who don't perform in a university, which is a separate thing, and it's it's a kind of, some of us live history and some of us go and write it afterwards, and I'm sure when you read the history, and particularly the histories of great moments or turning moments in history, they say, oh well, this thing happens and this thing happens, and you can bet that wasn't exactly what those people involved in that moment were thinking. They were thinking as humans, and the benefit of hindsight, you can fix anything around that. So coming back to this idea of musicianship, it seems to me that the key thing to create a musicianly society, if you like, is to teach musicianship, to teach the connection between the sound, the notation if you are using it, but it doesn't matter, the kind of essence of what you're aiming for. So in terms of our Western music, let's be honest, for most of the history of Western music, we have ultimately been talking about the amount of dissonance and the amount of consonance and how we like to use that in any time period. And that's pretty much what we're talking about until we get to, maybe 1940s. And even then, we're still talking about that in slightly different ways. But we're essentially saying this is this dissonant and we can add a bit more or a bit less, and we should do more or should do less. Now, the same kinds of systems, although they're not related to dissonance, are very much prevalent in other musics, such as Carnatic or Hindustani. And I underline this by saying I am in no way an expert or a performer of these traditions. So, but when you approach a certain a raga, you have certain things that you have to do to make that work, and there are certain things that have to be done, and there are certain things that are up to the individual performer. So in this sense, you can call that a theory, but I don't think any Indian musician would say, okay, I'm about to play this raga, the theory of this raga is this. They would say, no, this is how this piece goes, and that's therefore musicianship. And their guru or their audience would go, okay, I know how that piece is supposed to go, I know its nature. Did it go according to that for me? Did that work for me? Did that work in that moment? That's how we think about that. And it seems to me that's the key thing about any thing we're going to call theory, but really should call musicianship, is that So, for instance, if you've got some crazy composer like Gassmann in the Baroque period, who wrote the most crazy dissonant harmonies, for most people, I'm guessing that was too dissonant for that time period, and so you're kind of breaking the rules. But of course, when you hear that today, it sounds amazing and brilliant, and against the backdrop of modern Western music. So the theory of musicianship is simply that he was pushing the boundaries a bit faster
Yeah.
than was the norm. And I think that's really the key issue there, that one has to understand the nature or the essence of how that music kind of works. But at that point, in order to make it, rather than in order to go and discuss it at a conference, which I'm not saying that's a bad or a good thing to do. I mean, obviously, having studied for a PhD myself, I can hardly. I'm in the doghouse myself. But yeah, I think that's where I'd put that. That don't think of it as theory. I think theory is the wrong word for it. It's very definitely musicianship. And indeed, to come full circle on this, it seems to me, if you can't hear it, there's probably not much point in talking about it. So when someone says, "Oh, I can see," I've seen that this note on the first bar and this note in the 74th page are somehow related to each other. Well, I can't hear that. And if you can hear that, that's brilliant for you. You must experience music in a different way. But if I can't hear it, I don't think it's particularly important. What I can hear is these tensions and releases, both in the small term and the large term. And when I'm listening to other musics, to the extent that I'm able to understand them, I'm able to go, okay, I can see that thing that person did there was really quite daring or extraordinary, and I don't understand what he did there, but that's fine. I need to have more knowledge, Does that kind of answer your question, Paul?
It certainly does. I was
just waffle too much.
Kind of round up by saying, what incredible seeds you're sowing for the future generations. I mean, regardless of the brilliant work of the body work that you do yourself with classical music, also with your prog band, the Connoisseurs.
We haven't lately, but we must. It's just, I think hopefully it's inevitable that the Connoisseur will do some more. That we've still got basically everything ready for the triple album, obviously triple gatefold album, but we haven't actually recorded it, and so it does need recording. But thank you. But I'm just going to zip back for one moment, because something you just said sparked it in me. And thank you for being so kind about my work. You're right about this being the seeds. I have no particular, this is going to be a 50 or 60 or 70 year project, and I'm going to leave it part way through because of my death, obviously, if not before, because I get thrown out for something or the other. But no, sorry, just joking. But one thing I am hoping is that we will sow enough seeds, have enough good teachers, and have a large enough grassroots level that we will, in my lifetime, be able to start a fully fledged conservatoire in India, so that our kids do not have to keep coming over and paying huge amounts of money compared to India for an education in England or America. But we'll do it there, and I think there's just about possible that we will do that in my lifetime. But the key thing is, we don't want to do it too soon. If we do it too soon, we won't have the best students, and it'll fail, and everybody go, look at that third-rate conservatoire in India. If we can do it when there are enough really top students, because they've had a good enough education, and because they started seeing their peers also thinking about music, and it's become more normal, it's just the kind of thing that you do, or it's a possible thing you do, then just like we can start the St. Petersburg or the Moscow conservatoires at the right time in somewhere in India. It doesn't really matter where. And if our first graduating classes include Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, Scriabin, etc., or the equivalents, then we've done it. And I don't know if you remember, I did actually get to study in Moscow in the late 90s, and when us foreign students came up, there was the dean of foreign students or whatever, and he said, "Do you know why you guys are here?" And I go, "Well, I was good enough to come in," or whatever. He said, "No, it's because we're repaying a debt. When we first started these conservatoires, we stole the best composers, performers, etc. from the West and brought them here, and now we're paying our debt by allowing you to come." And my thinking is, actually, if we can steal some really great performers, composers, whatever, educators from the West in about I know, 10 to 15 years, let's be honest, we'll be able to show them the sun every day and have great food and give them great opportunities in India. That will be the start of the next stage where these seeds will have grown sufficiently that we can take it up to the next level. I think that's the really exciting next stage, hopefully. But it's all exciting, frankly, Paul. I can't wait to get you there. We need you there. Absolutely, it would be brilliant to have you there.
I was going to say that what would relate to what you're saying. I know Nitin Soni played in Manchester with an orchestra last week, and people like that really. I mean, he's such a brilliant artist anyway. But
amazing.
But he's bringing in such great influences that makes you want to delve into more and more detail into the, and so the cultures are and there's almost nothing better for social harmony than music.
Yeah. Oh golly, yeah. I mean, people tend to get angry at music concerts. Even at sports, people might occasionally get annoyed, but music does tend to. Were you at the concert?
No, sadly not. No.
Oh, okay, yeah, I would love to have heard about that. No, Nitin Soni is extraordinary, and there are so many others as well who are kind of producing really extraordinary music and finding ways to kind of to make something much more universal. I think it would be lovely, amazing if the 21st century is all about that kind of movement. It won't be, but it'll be partly about that, I suppose, and that'll be extraordinary. I think
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Karl. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you.
It's always a pleasure to hang with you, Paul. We don't do it. You know that.
It's like drinking from a fire hose. I learn so much every time.
I'm not sure that's a good thing. I don't think you're supposed to be drinking from fire hoses.
Well, it's so much. It's brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you so much.